A lot of jazz education is about theory and technique. You might notice this and assume that's what's most important in learning to play jazz piano. The truth is, theory and technique are not what's most important. I'd say out of 5 categories I might list for the most important things you need to do to improve as a jazz pianist, theory and technical rudiments could fit into just one of those 5 categories. When I started playing jazz piano, I was around 13, 14 years old, and I had only taken classical piano lessons. And I found this topic, how should I practice? I found it extremely frustrating and confusing. Over the years, I had a lot of great teachers who did give me some helpful advice about the most important things I could do on my own to learn about the music. So I'm hoping to share those in this video and basically create the video that I wish I could have seen when I was 15 years old. Let's start big picture. Jazz is an aural art form. We learn it by listening. And it's a lot like language that way. This is actually why my channel is called Piano Fluency. So think about how a native language speaker learns. You start by just hearing fluent speakers speak around you all the time before you even start trying to communicate. And then your first words sound ridiculous, but no one cares because you're a baby and it's cute. And eventually, through the act of trying to communicate over time, you gain fluency. Learning to play jazz is a lot like this. Yes, you need to practice theory and technique on your own, and this is a little like learning the grammar rules of a language. But you also need to listen to the music, to develop your vocabulary by transcribing great improvisers, to learn standard songs, and to just practice improvising with other people. Let's look a little deeper at these 5 categories. We'll start with listening. First and foremost, you want to be guided in your listening by your taste. Find the artists that you really love. For me, the starting point was always Oscar Peterson. I read his autobiography when I was 15, and then I totally fell in love with his music. So he was kind of this touchstone for me where I would explore his albums, and then other people on his albums would lead me into a new world of music, and I kind of went off from there. So it was this beautiful rabbit hole that I went down. And you can embrace your own rabbit hole. It might not be Oscar Peterson, but if you're interested in jazz piano, you should at least find a handful of jazz pianists whose music you really love, and you can use that as a starting place to explore the history of this music. You don't have to love all of it. There might be some historical jazz musicians who everyone agrees are great and important, and they're just not to your taste. That's certainly the case for me. But I think that's actually a good sign. It shows you're developing your own taste, and you just want to follow what you like. And if you discover that you don't enjoy any of it, then you shouldn't be trying to play jazz. Listening actively to great recordings will teach you things about a style of music that no teacher could ever put into words. And some especially helpful active listening exercises are to try tracking individual instruments through a recording. This will teach you to recognize the timbres of different instruments, and it will also teach you about what those instruments are doing and the roles of the instruments in an ensemble. You can also practice tracking the form of a song by listening actively. So typically in small group jazz, the improvisers will first play through the melody of a song with its accompanying chord changes, and then they'll play solos, repeating that same form of chord changes over and over again underneath the solos. And often tracking that form, tracking the chord changes as they go by, is a big challenge for beginner improvisers. You can practice that skill just by listening really closely to your favorite jazz recordings and trying to keep track of the form as it goes along. So you can follow individual instruments, follow the form, and also make big picture observations about what you're hearing and what you like. Learning to improvise is basically learning to be a composer, but you're composing in real time. This is a very hard thing to do. But part of being a composer is having your own ideas about aesthetics, having your own ideas about what it even means to play a good solo. And if you don't have that in your head, some sort of ideal of the solo that you're trying to play, learning to improvise better is more or less meaningless because there's no ideal that you're striving for. So listen closely to your favorite soloists. You might not know why at first you like what they're doing so much, but as you can start to make more and more accurate observations about what they're doing, then it will give you something that you can work on very attentively in your own practice. Category 2 is developing your vocabulary. When you hear a great jazz improviser, most of the time, the majority of what they play is not totally improvised. It comes from a kind of bank of patterns that they're used to playing. Sometimes these are called licks. Part of learning how to improvise, and especially learning how to sound like your playing belongs in a certain style of music, is exploring these licks that your favorite players play. And you may have heard that transcribing is important. So this is listening to a recording and figuring out all the notes and writing them down. Yes, that's important, but it's just the first step. And actually, I often recommend to students that they just start by finding one lick, one little piece of a solo that they really, really love, played over a song where they already know the form of the song. They already know the chord changes to the song. And this gives you an opportunity not only to transcribe that one spot that you really love, but then to work with it in a way that can get it into your own playing. Say I really love a Vince Guaraldi lick that goes like this. My next job is to play that in all 12 keys. So that was based on a G minor 7 chord. I'd now play it in C minor 7, F minor 7, B flat minor 7. So I'm going around the circle of fifths, and I'm seeing if I can play that exact lick in all 12 keys. Again, this is just the start of the process, because then what you need to do is you need to try using that little lick, that little piece of vocabulary, everywhere you possibly can in the standards that you know. If I'm playing Autumn Leaves in the key of B flat, so what I was doing there was trying to massage that lick somehow so that it fit over the chord changes of that entire 8-bar phrase. And when you first start doing this, it will be very difficult. You will not be able to successfully do it on the first try over every chord change. And that's actually the point. So this is a little bit like how in meditation they say that the point is not to not get distracted. It's that you get distracted, and the act of bringing your focus back is the value of the meditation. And I'd say that's true of this kind of practice with vocabulary. The fact that a given lick won't work very well over a lot of spots in the tunes that you play, that is what will really teach you how to play those songs, because trying to somehow adapt it and make it work over different parts of different sets of chord changes will teach you a lot about those chord changes. And at the same time, it will get that little musical moment that you're so obsessed with. It will turn it into something that becomes second nature for you and that will kind of come out naturally when you're improvising. I've talked to a lot of friends and peers who play jazz really well and who went to school for jazz, and most people agree this is pretty much the most important thing that you can do early on to get better at soloing. Transcribe, transpose, and apply new vocabulary. Category 3 is to learn standards. And this is something an older jazz musician in Los Angeles told me once when I was in college and I was playing one of my first standards gigs. And there were a lot of tunes getting called that I didn't know. And he pulled me aside at the break and said, you know, the best thing for you to do right now is to learn tunes. If you compare two musicians, the one who knows more tunes will usually be a better musician. The more tunes that you learn in a certain style, the better you understand that style of music. So learning the repertoire of jazz standards will make you a much better jazz musician. It will teach you about harmony. It will mean that you'll be able to play with other people more easily at something like a jam session. And it will also just help you recognize patterns that are common between different tunes, which makes it easier to hold on to all these tunes in your memory. And that's essential when you're improvising. It has to be really easy to remember the chord changes of a song, because the memory of the chord changes has to be almost completely automatic for you to feel comfortable improvising and taking chances while that's going on. So learning standards is a very important part of becoming a better jazz musician. And you can start small. You know, learning your first 5 standards from memory is probably about as hard as it is to learn the next 20 standards from memory. So start simple. Pick a jazz standard that you love. You can use a chart for the song when you're starting out, totally fine. Memorize the melody, memorize the bass, and then memorize the chords. You can memorize them in root position or just practice playing the 3rd and 7th of the chord in your right hand while your left hand plays the bass notes. As I said, you can start by playing from a chart. Once you've learned like 20 standards, start transitioning to learning them by ear. Sometimes that's a more accurate route, and it will certainly help the tunes live in a different place in your memory than if you're memorizing them from sheet music. And the last step that's really important to start doing as you progress is to transpose every new standard that you learn so that you understand the chord functions and the harmony. At first, that will be a really challenging added task once you've already memorized a song, then having to put it into other keys. But as you get better at that, the act of transposing or thinking in terms of chord functions will connect the songs better to your ear and actually make it easier to remember a song. Category 4 is just to improvise, and especially improvising with other people. There is no substitute for just getting in there and making a mess, because if you want to improvise well, there's a certain feeling to needing to think on your feet and roll with the punches when you make mistakes that you can't get if you aren't improvising. I struggled with this a lot when I was first trying to practice playing jazz. Honestly, it's still one of the hardest parts to me about playing improvised music. Whatever you do is going to be different every time, and you have to just embrace that. This is especially frustrating when you're starting out because it sort of means that there's no refining an individual solo. All that you can refine is your overall ability as an improviser. So when your overall ability as an improviser is still pretty low, every solo you play is gonna not sound that great. But the flip side of that is that as you start to improve, if every solo you play sounds kind of okay, every solo you play sounds kind of okay, and you can learn a new song and you'll still be able to play a solo that sounds kind of okay. And then eventually, once your solos start sounding pretty good, your solos will sound pretty good on every tune. So this is different from classical music where you work really hard on one piece and it can be kind of a showpiece that's way better than how it would sound if you were like sight reading a new piece of music. With jazz, it's more like however good you are is however good you are. And that's both frustrating and very rewarding as you begin to improve. So be brave and just start improvising. You can do this on your own. You can do it with play-along tracks. You should also seek out a way of doing it with other people. Because coming back to the language metaphor, you can't really get good at speaking a language by just reciting things aloud to yourself in a room. You have to start speaking it with and to other people. So this can be a challenge for adult music students, especially if you're seeking information online. I would suggest looking for local in-person music ensembles where there will be other adult beginners. So you might look for a local community college or music conservatory where there's some sort of adult beginner jazz ensemble. Your results will vary, but you should embrace that. The only way to get good enough that you belong in an ensemble of more advanced musicians is first to play in an ensemble of really beginner musicians. So when you're a beginner yourself, you're going to be playing with other beginners, and that's just how it works. So enjoy that process, and you might make some great friends if you seek out an ensemble to play in. And as you improve and you get more comfortable and more brave, you can start going to jam sessions. Jam sessions can be pretty intimidating. I'm still quite intimidated by jam sessions, and I went to school for jazz. I've been playing for more than 15 years. But there's something about the energy of a jam session that can feel pretty intimidating. But it's a great way to stretch yourself and to get comfortable in a new environment, playing with other jazz musicians and improvising. So we've reached category number 5, last but not least, learning theory and technique. I don't mean to imply with this video that theory and technique aren't important. They're very important. You just want to remember that the point of practicing with theory and technique is that if you think about them a lot, very deliberately in the practice room, you won't have to think about them as much when you're on the bandstand. And a lot of the greatest musicians went through a period of time where they practiced technique, practiced their theory rudiments obsessively, so that later in their career, they really didn't have to think about those things consciously at all. This was actually something that Oscar Peterson wrote in his autobiography, that he went through a period of obsessively practicing scales and other technical rudiments so that he would never be limited by his technique. I find that very inspiring. I can't necessarily say the same about myself, but I've certainly gone through periods in my life as a musician where that's been my goal. I want to really practice all of my scales and my drills so that I don't have to think about them as much and I can be more creative. And I do think a lot of musicians have that experience, that there's sort of this passage that you go through. It's kind of like a hero's journey of theory and technique, where you start out not knowing about them at all, and then you have to really think about them a lot and go through this kind of trial of practicing them and learning them. And eventually you reach a point where it's like the air clears and they become second nature, and you don't have to think about these things as much when you're playing. So that's it. 5 categories of things you can do to learn jazz piano. And remember, when you're planning your practice or your development as a jazz musician, these things don't have to be equal, but you do want them to be balanced. So if you feel like, well, yeah, I've just been working on theory and technique, but I haven't actually been improvising very much or playing with other people or learning new standards or transcribing, try to get these things in balance a little bit, and you might be surprised by the benefits you see. I'm Ted with Piano Fluency, and thanks for joining me.